The second question that was asked is, how did you find out? And I think some of you have already alluded to this, obviously, in your responses, but how did you find out about the incarceration experience, and what impact did the knowledge have on you when you did find out? So maybe we can start with Mary and Landon first on this question.
Okay. Our family never stopped talking about the incarceration, so we were not one of those part of the silent generation. Us children were more or less captive at the dinner table because we were not allowed to leave the table until my dad left, and that was about an hour after. And we weren't allowed to come to the table until he sat down. So in this conversation, we learned how to behave and also our values. We were taught that we should always be proud of who we are and never deny who we are. And then they taught us never to let others define us. And therefore, and the reason they taught us this constantly is because this is how they felt about themselves. Even if they were incarcerated, they never lost the dignity of who they are or what they wanted for their children. My parents were really a powerful team that led my sisters and brothers and I through this terrible journey that we were forced to take. But they never stressed anything that made us feel bitter or angry. My father's words that constantly were pounded into our heads was forgiveness. And like Nelson Mandela, who felt that forgiveness liberates the soul. And I think through that, my parents were able to succeed in whatever they did and was able to teach us what forgiveness does and learn, not forget what we went through, but learn from what we went through and become stronger in our drive to seek justice, not for just ourselves, but for the community.
Thank you, Mary. Landon?
So I think a lot of I'm not going to repeat what my mom said, but my experience is similar to that. I think my knowledge is a very personal knowledge of our family and each individual's experience with incarceration. So everything from, and over again, I've heard this story about my Ji-chan getting taken away by the RCMP and thrown into a truck, and exactly how that happened. But more than that, there was a recollection of the emotion that was experienced at the time by my 2 uncles and my 4 aunts, and my bachan, just going through those things. So it was a very sort of deep, not just informational, but emotional in terms of really learning about what it felt to go through those things. So around the dinner table, we talked about those things. Of course, my Auntie Al would make sure, that she would point her finger and tell me, your mother went through this, Ji-chan and Ba-chan went through this, and on and on and on. So, which is great. But, Mom talked a lot about forgiveness and the like. And I guess as a young child going through this, one of the most difficult things to understand was, I guess, a little bit of the dichotomy in terms of really understanding what they went through and the horrific things that they went through and they experienced, living conditions, getting separated, violence, racism. but then experiencing my Ji-chan and Ba-chan, my aunts and uncles, and how they lived their life, that life of forgiveness, that life of holding your head up, gambaru, all those things. I think that was trying to figure that out and understand that was a little bit different for me. I understand it now, but as a young child, you're kind of going, well, how could you go through all this stuff and feel that way? Because I never was I never was taught nor experienced bitterness, regret, any of those things, because that's just not what the family did. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Landon. We'll go to Kevin and Kayla next on this question.
I don't know. I guess maybe my dad was always a bit of a happy-go-lucky type of person, and he, when we were growing up, we lived across the street from a park, so we were three boys and a daughter, and so we spent a lot of time at the park, playing sports, whether it was baseball, hockey, and what have you. And my dad was quite involved actually as a coach for minor league baseball, and even getting involved as a director of hockey for the bantam division. So we really, I think growing up, that having that community around us and the park was a big part of our lives. We didn't have a lot of money to go on family vacations, but we spent a lot of time together, and it was a real sort of community type atmosphere. And so they didn't really, like I say, they didn't really dwell on the past and really think of it in the context of the social injustice and things of that nature. It really was, I think quite far removed, and I don't think it was suppressed. I think they just kind of got on with life and just lived life, and we were a busy family. But in my, it really wasn't until there was that the redress settlement, and unfortunately my dad passed away just before, so he never was able to get any of the redress money. And but Kayla alluded to my uncle, and that was Dr. Isomura, and he would have been a few years older than my dad when they went through internment, and I think he was always quite the intellect. So I think the social justice issues in the context of the internment, I think he thought about a lot more, and we used to have discussions with him, or I did from time to time, and he would, talk about the racism and just the difficult time, and I think he was probably 17 or 18 when they were in Greenwood, so I think he helped with teaching younger students in terms of schooling. And then through the church, he eventually left, and actually they ended up in Kingston, and he got into Queen's University and was studying physics, and anyhow eventually he went on to Montreal and studied medicine. But I think for him, some of the stories that he talks about just how just trying to rent a place, and people seeing that they're Japanese Canadian or maybe just Asian, there was a lot of doors slammed in their faces and things of that nature. So I think it was more, I think he experienced it in a much more direct sense, and he tells me stories about my dad where he'd have to get my dad out of bed because my dad wouldn't even go look for a job and things like that. And I don't know if that was the racism piece, or was that just my dad? But in any event, my dad went on and got an apprenticeship as a printer and was successful in his own right. But from my context, I hear of those stories and I understand that. And fortunately, in growing up, I never really felt any sort of direct racism or oppression. Just felt like I was just one of the regular kids, and we didn't do a lot in terms of even the regular Japanese food we would have. We'd probably have rice with most meals, but other than that, it was a lot of Western food or so there wasn't really a lot of tradition other than going to my aunt's place at New Year's and having the New Year's celebration.
So I think about when I first learned about the Japanese-Canadian history and my own family's experience with that a lot, just because I talk about it a lot. And I do say that when I first learned about it, it was, I could pinpoint the date. It was in 2014 when I attended the Japanese-Canadian Young Leaders Conference. And I was looking back at some of the agenda information about that yesterday. And I think part of learning about being exposed to that history for the first time was meeting other young Japanese-Canadian people, going on a walking tour of Steveston and learning about the history there. And for me, that was a really big, that was actually really how I feel like I learned about the fact that my family had experienced this history at all. I was thinking about it, I've been thinking about it recently too, because I have a vague memory of in high school knowing like, oh, I think my grandparents lived somewhere in BC for some reason, but I don't know why and I don't know where they were living. And I guess in hindsight, thinking about that, it was some sort of, I mean, I didn't know that they were interned or that they were in camps, and I didn't know about that part of the history. But I guess it's kind of like what you were saying, is that we don't really, or when I was in school, we didn't really talk about it, and maybe that's changing now, but so I don't really have the recollection of talking about it in school, or making that direct connection about it when I was in school. So it wasn't until when I was in my early 20s, when I was 20 years old, when I feel like I actually learned about this history. And I feel like learning about this history and learning about the community, that obviously just changed the course of my whole life, getting involved in the community, volunteering, attending events, learning about Japanese Canadian culture and heritage, being exposed to foods that I didn't grow up eating, and other things like that. And so through that, it really shaped how my involvement in the community by wanting to continue to meet other young people, whether people who've had experiences like me where they didn't grow up knowing a lot about this history, or people who grew up more connected to it. And so through that, I've attended National Young Leaders Conferences, helped organize local events here in Vancouver, and obviously I did the Suitcase Project, where I got to interview and talk to a number of 4th and 5th generation Japanese Canadians and Americans. So I think for me, that moment was very much an aha moment of, number one, oh, this history happened, and this history happened to my family, and number two, oh, there's other young Japanese Canadian and other young 4th generation Japanese Canadian people who exist. Because previous to that, the only people I really knew who were Japanese Canadian were in my family, and we never talked about it. We never talked about it, and kind of like my dad said about having New Year's, celebrating New Year's with his aunt. We still do that now, but even that was something that I didn't know was specifically a Japanese tradition. I just thought that my great aunt really liked New Year's for some reason. And I didn't understand that until I met other young people in the community who talked about celebrating New Year's or going to Japan to celebrate New Year's with their families. And I didn't realize that was actually a Japanese tradition until then. And I think that's really kind of the only Japanese tradition that we kind of hold in our family. And so, yeah, that's kind of it for me about how that learning that history has sort of impacted my life now.
Thank you, Kayla. Natsuki and Mike.
Thank you. Thank you. Personal assistant. There's feedback here. Yeah. Listening to Kevin and to Karen, that's very similar to my upbringing. I grew up in Burlington, Ontario, in the 60s and 70s, and our neighborhood was I was a very white Anglo-Saxon person until about 13. We did have a large family. Let me go back just briefly. My father's family came from Kyushu. They went to Port Alberni, and then they went to Lemon Creek. They were interned in Lemon Creek. My grandfather briefly was incarcerated in Angler. From Lemon Creek, they went to Hamilton, Ontario. My mother's side is from Kyushu as well, and they went to Paldi, just outside of Duncan, by Lake Cowichan. And they were a very large family. My mother was 13th of 14 kids. And they had a cousin, an uncle who lived beside them, an uncle and aunt. And they had 11 kids. So 25 kids here living beside each other in Paldi, British Columbia. And then they went to New Denver. The older boys went to work camps. The grandfather went to work on the highway building, the Hope Highway, number 3. And then they went to Ontario, Toronto, Montreal. So growing up, the majority of the Toyota family was in Ontario, as well as the Abe family. Abe family was very small. We would get together for New Year's dinners and all the different holidays because we were all in Hamilton. And the Toyotas, ever since the 60s, we'd have this big picnic, family picnics. There'd be like up to 200 people there. And so I would go every year, and there's all these people that had black hair, but they spoke English, and they ran around and played games and things, very much like One Big Hop of Families experience. Jeff talks about that. So that was my exposure to just the Japanese side. We didn't talk about it in German. We didn't, we were just playing, we were just normal Canadian families. I grew up playing hockey. We had the backyard rink. Everyone would come over. There was really no racism, discrimination. Any bullying was just taken care of on the ice. And so that was that until in grade 8. I was 13, and here's numbers as well. 13, we had to do a project and interview a family member. So for the Toyota side, both of my grandparents had passed away in the early 60s when I was very young, and as did my grandfather, Abe, Grandpa Abe. But my grandmother, Yachio or Bachan, she lived in Hamilton, and she lived to 2007, and at the age of 99. So I grew up very close with her. We would always go and visit her. But she spoke Japanese. She spoke very broken English. So it was hard to communicate. So I did this interview I asked my father if he would interview, and he said, no, I don't want, no, I have nothing to talk about. And well, I got to do this. I can't talk to Grandma. Mom says she's too young. She was only 6 when she went into New Denver. I just need to record, and he didn't want to go in front of the tape recorder. So I said, well, just tell me, and then I'll just do the interview myself. Oh, hi, Dad. Oh, hi, Mike. And that's what I did. But he very reluctantly told me his story, and I was floored. Here I was, 13, thought I was white. Now I'm this. I'm a visible minority, invisible to me at the time. And I got so intrigued, and I was talking to my aunts, I was talking to other aunts, and depending on their age, my Uncle Mass, he was very much older, and he would tell me about his life in working in the work camps, and how he really hated it, and they would do, anyways, he would tell us stories, but I didn't really get much. But I wanted to talk to my grandmother, and I wanted to learn these stories. And so this was in the mid-'70s, and then around 1977 in Hamilton, the Nisei got together, and they started to organize a cultural center. And they founded in 1977 on Tiora in Hamilton. And their original Tammy Hirazawa, like she's sorry. Yeah. We go way back, but I can't remember what she looks like. So our families worked together, and there was many layers of Japanese families there, all the Issei, Nisei, Sansei, and we would do all the bazaars and the yard sales and the martial arts and the cultural arts. And now I felt a sense of belonging. Oh, there's other people that are doing this, not just my cousins and things that we get together once a year, the Toyota side. But here we have activities, and I made some really great friends, Sansei, friends that are friends still today. But I really got more intrigued about our history. They were all about being Sansei and Nisei, but they weren't necessarily talking about the internment. This is a little bit before the redress movement. So I really wanted to talk to my grandmother, and so I started to take Japanese class there. They just had an informal class there. They didn't have it at university yet. And I went to McMaster, and I was studying, but I really wanted to go to Japan. I really wanted to learn Japanese. I really wanted to be able to come back and ask my grandmother about her experience. And so I did. I finished my degree. I went to Japan. I spent 6 years there, learned the language to a fair amount. And then I came back. And we had moved, we came back. We didn't come back to Hamilton. Well, we came back for a little while, but we ended up moving back to Victoria. So we're still far apart. So I didn't really always have a chance to talk with her, but when we would go back and I would talk with her, I was expecting her to come out and tell me all these stories, good stories, bad stories about Lemon Creek. And to her, she just said, oh, that. She was totally shoganai, shikataganai. It's like this was just in the past. She's so proud that I went to university, and my other siblings have gone to university. My sister has 3 kids, and we all have good jobs, and we're doing well. And to her, that was the most important thing for her. So I think that was a turning point for me, in that that was the turning point where I really felt motivated to learn more about what they went through. And so it was a culmination of, and eventually my father going to conferences where he saw other people from Lemon Creek telling their stories. And he said, oh, I think people are interested in hearing my story. So he started to talk about it. Some of my aunts in my other side, my dad's side, were able to remember things. So I started to gain more stories about this. And then, just as I mentioned, doing landscapes and learning about not just the stories, but the files, the Bird Commission, and all the case files. It's been really a culmination of a whole lifetime to learn about the experience or about the internment.
Yes, go ahead, Mary.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I think I'm the same age as your father. So I was 7 when the incarceration took place. I really want to thank my parents, because you always hear that children had lots of fun. Of course we did. We had lots of fun because our parents hid the horrors of the incarceration from us. And so, they sacrificed so much in order to give us a normal life, so-called normal life, in the incarceration camp or in the sugar beet fields, wherever. And then another thing I'd like to say is when my younger sister retired from being an administrator at UBC, she went back to Salt Spring Island. And her goal was to educate as many Salt Spring Islanders about the incarceration of Japanese Canadians. So each day she would go to the grocery store and corner one person. And she would not let that person go until she finished her whole story. And so in this way, a lot of people on Salt Spring Island learned about what happened to Japanese Canadians.
That's great. Thank you, Mary. Natsuki?
Hello? Yeah. No. So I can very vividly. I was also 13 when I found out, and so. But before that, I had a vague idea of something had happened to Japanese Canadians and BC, but I never really connected that to my family until, I guess, in Lemon Creek, there's signage that was put up in 2012. And so I was 13 that year, and they wanted to have a bit of a ceremony, and they flew out. I think Joy Kagawa was there, and they had, and so we flew my grandparents out, and so we made a trip of it, and so they flew into Victoria. We road tripped. We went to the Nikkei National Museum, the New Denver Internment Memorial Center, and that's where my grandmother was interned. That's where her family was. And I remember very vividly, well, as vividly as you can remember when you're groggy in a car and you wake up and suddenly told, "We're here, come on out, let's go inside." And I'm like, "Where are we? I was just asleep in the car, I'm 13. And we walk in, and if you've ever been there, they have this whole list of all the families and what cabin they were in. And so I'm tired, I'm half asleep, and I follow everyone into this building, and there's Grandma. She has her finger on this big list, and she's looking. She goes, "Oh, there it is, Toyota." And I go, "What? What does this mean?" And so and she was very young. She was about 6. And so she's always said she doesn't really remember much. She doesn't remember stories. But when she was there, they have recreations of the shacks and the houses. And she's telling stories left and right. She's saying they have this stove set up and she says, "Oh yeah, when it was cold, my sisters and I, we'd put our backs to the stove and we'd flip up our skirts and warm up." And just cute stories like that, right, that you don't really think about. And I had this moment of connecting my family to this history. And it made me really, really interested just to find out what else is there. And so from there, we went to the Lemon Creek ceremony. And so Dad and his siblings, they all sponsored a bench to surprise my grandparents. They sponsored a bench and have inscription on it saying what.
It's dedicated to Ken Abe, Lemon Creek, and Ruth Abe, ni Toyota, New Denver, and to the perseverance and pioneer spirit of the Issei generation.
And so, and Grandpa, he's being treated kind of like a celebrity. He's, I think, one of the only people who were in Lemon Creek at that ceremony. And so he's telling stories about picking blackberries in the summer along the train track. And it's just this moment of, it's just constantly these moments of me clicking with what the history has to do with my family who I grew up with living in Ontario, far, far away from BC. I'm not thinking about how my family has a history in BC on Vancouver Island. And so that kind of sparked my interest in not only history, but also my family's history. But unfortunately, Grandpa passed away about later that month. So I never got a chance to really connect and get his story. It was difficult thinking about how I never grew up around them. They were always in Ontario. I would see them maybe once every 2 years because I would summer in either Japan and visit my Jichan Bachan, or go to Ontario and see them there. So I never really got a chance to really talk to Grandpa about that. And but nevertheless, it was at 13, it's kind of a hard, if you don't know it very well, then it's a hard conversation to broach, especially if he's kind of resistant to wanting to talk about it. And so it's feeling that loss of a chance to connect and hear family stories from my grandfather. It's made me really want to learn the stories mostly through Dad, and some stories through my great aunts and uncles, but mostly my great aunts. And it's really impacted me on how I view learning history. And I'm a history student now, and it's also impacted me, and it's made me want to share my family's history too, in a way that's makes other Nisei, Yonsei generation want to learn their own, because I think it's very important, especially this as the generations who live through the history are aging and stories are being lost.
Thank you so much.